The bond was dying. Lucia Whitlock knew it the moment she pressed her palm flat against Rasmus Ravenshade's chest, and felt the absence where ancient power should have hummed like a second heartbeat. 12 other healers had already fled this room. She had watched them go one by one, their faces pale with a terror she understood completely, and had chosen to ignore. The chamber beneath the Ravenshade court was carved from black stone that had been old, before London had a name, and the cold that lived inside it had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of something sacred unraveling. "Leave," Rasmus said. His voice was barely above a whisper, which was somehow more frightening than a shout. He lay against pillows of dark silk, white hair spilled across them like frost on volcanic rock, and his silver eyes tracked her with an intensity that made her pulse jump even now, even in the middle of all of this. "That is an order, Lucia. You can put that order somewhere deeply inconvenient," she said. And she pressed harder, pushing the thin current of her healing energy against the fraying edges of what she could feel inside him. It was like trying to hold water in a cracked cup. The bond, the ancient vampiric soul thread that every vampire of his lineage carried from the moment of their creation, was tearing loose from its anchor point. Without it, an ancient could not sustain his court, his power, or his mind. Without it, Rasmus Ravenshade, who had lived for 800 years and ruled half the vampire world from the shadows of modern civilization, would dissolve into something that was neither alive nor dead. A door crashed open behind her. She did not turn around. The human is still here. The voice belonged to Vordakai, Rasmus' second chancellor, and it dripped with a contempt so refined it had clearly been practiced over centuries. "My lord, this is an embarrassment. She cannot help you. Her kind has never stabilized a bond dissolution. It has never been done." "Then I will be the first," Lucia said flatly, still not turning. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded violence. She felt it across her shoulders like a blade not yet swung. Then Rasmus made a sound, low and rough. That was not quite a laugh. "You heard her, Vordakai," he said. "Close the door." The door closed. Lucia exhaled slowly and let herself feel the full shape of the crisis under her hands. She had been a healer since she was 19. Formally trained at the Meridian Institute for Supernatural Medicine, informally trained by the School of Making Catastrophic Decisions with Excellent Intentions. She was 26 now, and she had worked in vampire courts for 3 years, and she had never seen anything like this. She had also never stood this close to Rasmus Ravenshade for this long, without a formal 10 feet of protocol space between them. His skin was the cool white of old marble, and his features were the kind that painters had once gone to ruin, trying to capture, too symmetrical, too sharp, somehow both ancient and ageless. Under other circumstances, she would have described him as the most beautiful and dangerous thing she had ever encountered in a world that was full of dangerous and beautiful things. Under these circumstances, she was mostly describing him as the most infuriating patient she had ever had, because he kept trying to close off the parts of himself she needed to reach. "Stop blocking me," she said. "I am not blocking you." "You absolutely are. Every time I get close to the anchor site, you pull back. It feels like trying to catch smoke." She looked at him directly for the first time since she had begun the assessment, which was a mistake she had been carefully avoiding because direct eye contact with Rasmus Ravenshade at close range did something inconvenient to her concentration. His silver eyes were fixed on her face with an expression she could not name. "I need you to trust me." Something moved across his features. It was brief and almost invisible, but she had been watching people closely since childhood, and she caught it. Something old and difficult and heavily guarded. "The last healer who asked me for trust," he said slowly, "reported the full condition of my bond to the Obsidian Conclave before the ink on her confidentiality agreement was dry." Lucia went still. The Obsidian Conclave. She knew the name. Every healer who worked in vampire circles knew the name the way sailors knew the name of a particular reef. They were the governing body that theoretically oversaw vampire law and practically served the interests of whoever had paid them most recently. And a fading bond in the Lord of Ravenshade court was exactly the kind of vulnerability they would exploit without hesitation. "That's why they're moving against you," she said quietly, pieces falling into place with a cold clarity she did not enjoy. The political maneuvering over the last 2 months, Vordakai's little coalition of discontent, the The challenges to your territorial claims in Eastern Europe, they already know. They have known for approximately 6 weeks, Rasmus confirmed. His voice was very even, which gives you some context for why trust is not something I produce easily at present. Lucia looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small device, the kind that looked like a thumb drive but was in fact a sealed recorder linked to a Meridian Institute legal archive. She held it up so he could see it, then set it deliberately on the bedside table. "That records everything in this room," she said. "Every word, every diagnostic reading, every piece of information exchanged. It goes directly to the Meridian Institute's sealed archive, which, under the Supernatural Accord of 1987, is legally inaccessible to the Obsidian Conclave or any political body without a full tribunal review. If I betray your confidence, it will be documented, and I will lose my license, my freedom, and approximately every other thing I value." She held his gaze. "That is not a guarantee built on trust. That is a guarantee built on mutual accountability, which I understand you find more comfortable." The silence stretched. "You researched me," he said. "I research all my patients." "No, you researched me specifically. You anticipated this conversation." He studied her with an expression that had shifted into something she recognized as genuine interest, which felt somehow more significant than anything else that had happened in the last hour. "Most people do not anticipate me. Most people are too busy being frightened of you to think clearly," she said. "I decided early on that being frightened of you was a luxury I could not afford if I was going to be useful to you, so I skipped it." "You are not frightened of me," he repeated slowly, as though testing the words. "I did not say that. I said I decided not to let it drive my actions." She picked up his hand, which was cool and still under her fingers, and began moving her diagnostic energy deeper. "Now will you please stop blocking me and let me help you?" This time, he did not pull back. What she found when he finally let her in was devastating and magnificent in equal measure. The ancient bond was not simply fading. It was fracturing along lines that suggested it had been deliberately damaged, cut at specific structural points with a precision that spoke of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This was not natural dissolution. This was sabotage. "Rasmus," she said carefully, "how long ago did you have a blood exchange with another ancient?" The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. She was not being metaphorical. She could feel it against her skin. "I have not performed a blood exchange in over a century," he said, and his voice had gone to something very quiet and very still, the way water went still before a storm broke across it. "Then someone introduced foreign ancient blood into your system, without your knowledge or consent," she said. "Because what I am reading here is not natural deterioration. Someone targeted your bond anchor deliberately, and they used the kind of power that only comes from an ancient's blood. They have been slowly dissolving the structural threads for weeks." She looked up at him. "You were poisoned." The word landed between them like a stone into dark water. Rasmus sat up slowly, and despite everything, despite the damage running through him, like hairline cracks through old stone, the movement was fluid and controlled, and utterly without weakness in any visible sense. It was a remarkable performance of dignity. She had the sudden, fierce, entirely inappropriate urge to tell him that he did not have to perform for her. "Vodkai," he said. "I don't know. Possibly. The entry point would have been something you consumed, something you touched that carried trace blood contamination. A gift, perhaps. Food prepared by someone else's hands." She was already moving through the diagnostic picture in her mind, organizing what she knew against what she needed to do. "The good news is that the anchor threads are damaged but not yet severed. The bond is fading because the anchor is being slowly starved. If I can repair the anchor point and cut off whatever pathway is still feeding the poison into your system, the bond will restabilize on its own. Your body knows how to maintain it. It just needs the attack to stop and the existing damage to be addressed." "And the difficulty," he said, "is that repairing an anchor point requires a healer to work at the deepest level of a vampire's energy structure, a level that is not accessible without complete lowering of all defensive barriers." He looked at her steadily. "A vulnerability that would leave me entirely exposed for the duration of the work." "Yes," she said. "You understand what you are asking of me. I understand exactly what I am asking of you." She did not soften it. She had learned that he preferred directness to comfort. "I am asking you to be completely undefended in the presence of a human you have known for 3 years at a professional distance, while your enemies are circling and your own court may be compromised. I know how that sounds." He was quiet for a moment. The chamber hummed with the weight of 8 centuries of learned caution. 3 years, he said then, and something shifted in his tone, something that was not quite assessment, and not quite the careful warmth she had learned to translate from his formal manner. "You have been in my court for 3 years, Lucia. You have treated 14 members of my household. You have argued with Vordakai approximately 40 times that I am aware of, and won 37 of those arguments on merit. You negotiated a treaty provision for healer access rights that the Conclave has been trying to block for a decade, and you did it through sheer documented persistence." The silver eyes were warm in a way that was rare and careful. "I know your competence. I know your integrity. What I have been uncertain of, in the selfish manner that is particular to those who have been betrayed by exactly the people they chose to trust, is whether knowing those things is sufficient reason to make the choice you are asking of me." Lucia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think it has to be. I think at some point, after you have gathered every fact and measured every risk, there is still a moment where you have to decide whether the fear of being hurt again is worth more than the chance of something good. And only you can answer that." He looked at her for a long time. "Begin," he said. What followed was the most complex healing work she had ever attempted, and she had once spent 14 hours reconstructing the nervous system of a vampire who had been caught in a dawn ambush. The anchor point of an ancient's bond was located in a space that existed somewhere between the physical heart and something older, something that did not have a name in human anatomy because it had never existed in human bodies. It felt, when she reached it, like a small sun that had been slowly strangled. The poisoning had wrapped around it like a net of fine wire, each thread cutting a little deeper each, and she understood now why it had taken weeks to become symptomatic. Whoever had done this had been patient and precise and utterly without mercy. She worked with the kind of focused silence that she had spent years cultivating. Her energy moved in careful increments, testing each strand of damage before she addressed it, building a picture of the full architecture of the harm before she began reversing it. Rasmus held himself absolutely still, and she could feel the effort that cost him, the constant subtle war between his instinct to defend himself and the conscious choice to let her work. She could feel his presence in the place where she was working, not aggressive, not withdrawn, just present in a way that was startlingly honest. She had been working for perhaps 2 hours when she hit the source. It was not Vordakai, the signature of the poisoning, the specific quality of the foreign ancient blood that had been used to drive it, was something she recognized from the medical records she had been given access to when she first joined the court. She had read them thoroughly, because that was the kind of healer she was. And now the reading of them paid off in a way that felt deeply unpleasant, because the signature she was tracing led her, with horrible, logical certainty, to a name she had not expected. She pulled back enough to speak without losing her connection to the anchor work. "Rasmus," she said carefully, "the source of the poisoning. I need to tell you something that is going to be very difficult to hear." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Saravan, she blinked. "You already knew. I suspected from the pattern of access." His voice was controlled and entirely empty of the pain that she could feel radiating from him like heat from cold stone, that particular paradox that was his. "Saravan has been my court's master of provisions for 60 years. He has access to everything I consume. He is also, as of approximately 4 months ago, in the service of the Obsidian Conclave, though he does not know that I know this." A pause. I did not want to move against him without proof of the mechanism. I needed to know what he had done and whether it could be reversed. "It can be reversed," she said immediately. "That is the first thing I want you to know. The damage is not permanent. But I need you to understand that cutting the active poisoning pathway means I need to also address a secondary anchor that Saravan will have placed somewhere in your environment. Something physical that is continuously refreshing the compound in your system. If I repair the bond without finding and removing that, it will simply begin dissolving again within days." "The decanter on my study desk," he said. The one delivered as a gift from the Vosemba delegation 6 weeks ago. That would be my first guess. Yes, I will have it removed. A brief pause. By someone I trust absolutely. Who do you trust absolutely? The question came out before she could stop it, shaped by 3 years of watching him keep everyone at exactly the distance that served them without serving him. 3 years of watching a man who could have had any loyalty he demanded instead, holding himself apart from it like someone who had forgotten that it was allowed. She expected him to deflect. She expected the smooth, careful redirect that was his social armor. Instead, he said quietly, "You are on a very short list." The anchor work pulsed under her hands like a second heartbeat returning. She made herself focus. She sent Seravan's arrest through the court's security channel using Rasmus's authorization and her own digital witness seal from the Meridian Institute, a combination that was legally unimpeachable under both vampire court law and the supernatural accord. She did this while still maintaining the healing work, which required a level of multitasking that left her slightly lightheaded, but she managed it because there was simply no alternative. The decanter was located by Tavrik, Rasmus's personal guard, who was one of approximately 3 members of the court staff that she had long privately assessed as genuinely loyal rather than politically aligned. He found it, sealed it in a containment vessel, and removed it from the premises without drama or ceremony. And then she went back to the anchor point with both hands and everything she had. The repair took another 4 hours. She lost track of time in the way that only happened during the deepest healing work when the world narrowed to the task at hand, and the only reality was the architecture of what needed to be fixed. She was aware of Rasmus throughout. His breathing, the slow steadying of his presence as the damage was addressed, the gradual return of something full and luminous to the place where the bond anchor lived. It was, she thought in the part of her mind that was always slightly poetic despite everything, like watching a star uncovered from cloud. When she finally pulled back and opened her eyes, her hands were shaking. "Done," she said. Rasmus sat up, and this time the movement was different. The controlled performance of strength was gone, and what remained was simply strength, real and unforced. The way he must have been before the poisoning had begun its slow work. The silver of his eyes was clear and bright, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was unguarded. "Lucia," he said. "You should rest," she said, because she was tired and her hands were shaking, and the way he was looking at her was doing something significant to her ability to think carefully. "You have been in this room for 6 hours," he said. "You have performed a reconstruction that has never been successfully completed in recorded supernatural medical history. You did it alone, without assistance, after 12 of your colleagues fled." He rose from the bed, and she stepped back reflexively, and he followed the step forward, not aggressively, just closing the distance that she had instinctively created. "You are exhausted, and you are trying to be professional, and I am asking you, for the space of 1 moment, to stop being professional." She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the intricate silver white of his hair, the cool, perfect marble of his skin, the 800 years of careful gravity that lived in his features, alongside something newer and more raw. "What would non-professional look like?" she asked. Exactly. Tell me what you actually feel," he said. "Not what you assess. Not what you diagnose, what you feel." The question landed in her chest like a key in a lock she had forgotten she was carrying. "Terrified," she said, honestly. "Relieved. Furious at Seravan, and at the conclave, and at Vordakai, even though it turns out Vordakai was probably not directly involved. Slightly overwhelmed that it worked because there was a real possibility that it would not." She held his gaze. "And something else that I have been carefully not feeling for approximately 3 years, because you were my patient and my employer's sovereign, and because I am a practical person who does not indulge in things that have no logical future." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was something rarer and more careful, and it undid her completely. "Tell me about the thing you have not been feeling," he said. She took a breath of, "Rasmus, tell me. I think you know. I would like to hear it." She looked at him for a long moment. This ancient, impossible, infuriating, magnificent creature who had trusted her with the most vulnerable part of himself, on a basis of 3 years of professional contact and 1 honest conversation, and she thought about all the very sensible reasons she had catalogued over 3 years for why this was not a thing she should feel, and she decided, as she had decided 6 hours ago about fear, that the reasons against were not more valuable than the thing itself. "I think I love you," she said, or something that is pointing very strongly in that direction. "I have been managing it." The silence stretched. His expression went through something she could not fully name, something that moved like light through water, complicated and shifting and finally settling into something clear. "You have been managing it," he repeated. "I am a professional." "You are the most extraordinary person I have encountered in 8 centuries, he said, and the words came out with a precision that told her they had been chosen carefully and meant exactly as stated. "That is not a compliment I offer with ease. It is an assessment of record." She laughed, which surprised both of them. It came out tired and genuine and slightly watery around the edges, and his expression shifted again into something warmer. "You are making love declarations sound like court documentation," she said. "I am a formal person." "You are absolutely a formal person, and I find it unreasonably endearing." She took a step toward him without thinking about it, the same way she had been making unreasonably brave choices all day. "How long have you been managing it on your end?" The slight widening of his eyes was barely visible and probably invisible to anyone who had not spent 3 years reading the micro-expressions of a man who had spent 8 centuries making sure his face told people nothing. "Longer than is dignified to admit," he said. "Tell me anyway." "Since the evening you argued Vordakai into the floor over the blood law amendment," he said. "You were furious and precise and completely without fear of consequences. And I thought with some alarm that I had not felt that particular kind of admiration in a very long time." He paused. "That was 18 months ago." Lucia stared at him. 18 months. "I am," he said, with a faint thread of dry self-awareness, occasionally slow to act on personal matters. "You are 800 years old, and you sat on your feelings for 18 months. I had reasons. I would very much like to hear the reasons." He moved a step closer, and she held her ground. And the space between them became something charged and careful and full of the weight of all the reasons and all the months and all the professional distance that had been very sensibly maintained and was now, she thought, finished. "You are human," he said, "which means you are mortal. Which means that anything I allowed to grow between us would have an ending built into it, and I have lost enough people across 8 centuries to know that I am not as indifferent to loss as I have trained myself to appear. I did not want to begin something that I would have to end." A pause. "And I did not want to be the reason you traded the open breadth of a human life for the narrow complexity of mine." Lucia was quiet for a moment, letting the fullness of that settle, the honor in it, the particular kind of sacrifice that looked from the outside like withdrawal and was actually protection. "Rasmus," she said, "you should have told me and let me decide." "Yes," he said, "I know that now. I knew it somewhat less clearly before you spent 6 hours repairing my soul." That is a surprisingly poetic way to describe it. I have been called poetic before. Mostly by people who were then immediately frightened by something else I said. She stepped forward and put her hand against his chest, the same gesture with which she had begun the whole evening, but entirely different now. No diagnostic intent, just the warmth of her palm against the cool silk of his shirt, over the steady thrum of a bond that was whole again. He went very still in the way that she recognized as his version of holding his breath. "The mortality problem has solutions," she said quietly. "Not easy ones. But they exist. That conversation can happen when we are both less exhausted and when your court is not in the middle of a political crisis." She looked up at him. "What I am saying is that the reasons against are not insurmountable, and I would very much like to stop being managed and start being addressed." Something broke open in his expression. It was small and controlled and probably invisible to anyone who was not looking for it, but she was always looking, and she saw it clearly. The long-held guard coming down. He raised his hand and touched her face with a gentleness that was startling from someone who carried that much power, 2 fingers against her cheekbone, careful and deliberate. "You stabilized my bond," he said quietly. "I did. You also, in the same evening, rather efficiently stabilized something else entirely. I noticed." He bent his head and kissed her, and it was gentle in the way that things are gentle when they have been held back for a very long time, and are finally, carefully released. She curled her hands in the front of his shirt and kissed him back and thought, with the part of her mind that never fully stopped thinking, that 6 hours ago she had been holding a dying bond together by sheer force of will and stubbornness, and apparently that was just the kind of evening she had, the aftermath of a court crisis. She would learn in the weeks that followed, was almost more complicated than the crisis itself. Saravan was held under court arrest pending tribunal, which under vampire law meant he was confined in conditions that were technically comfortable and practically terrifying. Because vampire court confinement came with an absolute isolation that ancient creatures found deeply unbearable. He confessed within 48 hours, not because he was broken, but because he was underneath the betrayal. Someone who had made a desperate choice for reasons that were complicated and partially sympathetic and ultimately unacceptable, and he seemed to understand the distinction. His contract with the Obsidian Conclave was documented, dated, and submitted to the Meridian Institute's legal archive through Lucia's recorder, which meant it was legally airtight and publicly inaccessible to manipulation. The Conclave's leadership spent approximately 1 week trying to argue that the documentation was falsified, and then gave up when 3 of their own council members looked at the quality of the evidence, and quietly suggested that continuing to fight it was not a strategically sound position. Vordakai, who had not been directly involved in the poisoning but had absolutely been leveraging the knowledge of the bond deterioration for his own political positioning, was a more complicated problem. Rasmus handled it himself, in a closed meeting that Lucia was not present for, and which apparently lasted 3 hours. Vordakai emerged from it looking like a man who had been very precisely and very thoroughly reminded of exactly where he stood, and what would happen if he chose to continue standing in the wrong place. He was not removed from his position. He was, instead, given a specific and non-negotiable set of conditions under which he would continue in that position. Conditions that Lucia suspected were as much about leverage as rehabilitation, and which Vordakai accepted with the careful face of someone recalibrating their ambitions significantly downward. The Ravenshade court stabilized. It did so in the specific, deliberate way that ancient things stabilize when they have been shaken down to their foundations and found to be more solid than expected. The political challenges to the territorial claims dissolved when the challengers understood that Rasmus was not weakened and that the moment they had been angling toward had passed. The conclave shifted their attention elsewhere with the practiced smoothness of a body that had learned never to commit publicly to a losing bet, and Lucia stayed. This was, apparently, the subject of significant discussion in both the supernatural medical community and the wider court world. She was aware of it, she had expected it. She had also, by the time it became a topic of conversation, already decided that she was not particularly interested in adjusting her choices to suit the comfort of people who had not been in that room. She continued her work. She maintained her Meridian Institute credentials. She took on a consultancy role with the Ravenshade court that was formally documented, legally protected, and practically meant she had an office in the court's medical wing and access to resources she had only previously dreamed about. She also had, in the evenings, conversations with Rasmus that ranged from court politics to 8th-century-old history, to the specific mechanics of supernatural biology, to the kind of quiet territory that neither of them had been in the habit of covering with anyone. He was, she discovered, a reader of extraordinary breadth who retained everything and had opinions about all of it. He was precise and fair, and had a sense of humor that was dry to the point of being almost invisible and then suddenly devastatingly funny. He was, in private, considerably less formal than his public manner suggested, though formality was genuinely part of his character rather than purely a performance, and she found she did not mind it. She had always had a weakness for precision. He discovered that she was someone who functioned best when she was slightly overextended. Not because she was reckless. She would protest this strenuously, and he would not argue it because he had seen her in action, but because she was most alive when the problem in front of her was at the outer edge of her capability. He found this, to his own mild surprise, something he recognized. He had been the same for 8 centuries. One evening, Approximately 2 months after the night of the bond stabilization, they were in his private study, which was a room of dark wood and lit candles and walls of books that would have made most academics weep. And she was reading a diagnostic text, and he was reviewing court correspondence, and there was a fire in the grate and the particular silence of two people who had learned to be comfortable in each other's quiet. And she looked up and said, without preamble, the mortality conversation. He set down his correspondence. Yes, he said, I want to have it. Not because I have decided what I want, but because I think we should both understand what the options actually are before either of us decides anything. She closed her book. I have done the research. Of course you have, he said, and the warm thread in his voice was genuine and entirely unguarded. The known pathways for human vampire life extension are three, she said. The first is the full blood bond, which is permanent, irreversible, and transforms the human into a vampire. The second is a partial blood covenant, which extends human lifespan significantly, but does not alter the fundamental nature of the person, and requires renewal periodically. The third is the anchor-sharing protocol that was documented in the Thessalian Accords of 1453, and has not been widely used since because it requires the vampire to voluntarily connect a portion of their bond to the human's life force, which slows the human's aging without altering their nature, but creates a mutual vulnerability in the vampire. She paused. That third one is the one I find most interesting. He was very still, because it requires vulnerability on my part. Because it is the most equitable, she said. It does not ask me to become something different. It asks you to share something fundamental. That feels like the right basis for a choice if we are going to make one. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was, she thought, the closest thing to awe that 8 centuries of careful guardedness ever permitted. You have been thinking about this for some time, he said. I have been thinking about it since about 2 days after the bond stabilization, she admitted. I did not want to bring it up too early because we were still in the middle of the court crisis, and also because I wanted to be certain I was thinking about it clearly rather than emotionally. And now? I am thinking about it both clearly and emotionally, which I believe is the appropriate state for this kind of decision. He rose from his chair and crossed the room to where she sat, and she tipped her head back to look at him as he stood before her, and he held out his hand with a formality that was also, she had learned to read, a kind of tenderness. Come here, he said. She took his hand and stood, and he drew her close with that same careful gentleness that still made her catch her breath despite weeks of growing familiarity, and as he said, with the precision that was his version of speaking from the deepest part of himself. I have not wanted a future in approximately 4 centuries. I had not realized this until 6 hours in a chamber with you when I discovered, with some disorientation, that I wanted one again very badly. He looked at her steadily. I am not suggesting urgency. You are 26 and there is time. But I want you to know that whatever choice you make, I will be here, and I am not, as it turns out, afraid of the vulnerability of the third option. Lucia put her free hand against his chest, over the place where his bond anchor hummed steady and whole and bright. Good, she said, because I have a proposal. His eyebrow rose fractionally. Not that kind of proposal, she said. Not yet. I mean a research proposal. I want to document the bond stabilization formally and submit it to the Meridian Institute. Not with identifying information, not anything that creates vulnerability for you, but because what I found in the structure of the damage taught me things about bond architecture that are not in any existing literature, and there are healers who will need that information eventually. She held his gaze. I want to use what we went through to help other people, and I want your permission, because it is your story as much as mine. He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled, the books watched. Yes, he said. On the condition that you let me review the documentation before submission. Absolutely. And that you include in the methodology section the note that the standard 12-healer rotation failed, and the work was completed successfully by a single practitioner working alone, because I believe that is a relevant data point for the field. She stared at him. Are you advocating for my professional recognition? I am noting a methodological fact, Rasmus. The fact that it reflects well on you is incidental. She laughed and pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and she felt his arm come around her, and the steady thrum of his bond against her palm was the most solid and present thing she had ever felt. 3 months later, the research submission was accepted for publication in the Meridian Institute's primary journal and simultaneously flagged as a landmark contribution by the Supernatural Medical Review Board. The notation that the successful completion had been performed by a single practitioner where a 12-person team had failed was included in the methodology section, exactly as Rasmus had specified, and it generated a significant amount of commentary in the field. Lucia handled the professional attention with the same precision she handled everything else, which was to say, she responded to genuine inquiry, redirected political attempts to use the publication as a lever, and was privately pleased that the work was reaching people who needed it. Rasmus handled the attention to Lucia by being, as he described it in a characteristically restrained way, supportive. What this actually looked like was that when the Meridian Institute's director of supernatural medicine flew to London to discuss the paper and spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting being subtly dismissive about the plausibility of the methodology before Lucia could fully address it, Rasmus appeared in the doorway of the meeting room with the specific quality of presence that 8 centuries of absolute authority produces and said simply, "The methodology is accurate. I was the patient." The director's tone changed within approximately 15 seconds. Lucia, who had been handling it perfectly well on her own, found herself experiencing a feeling that she later described to him as simultaneously annoyed at the implication that she needed help and genuinely and embarrassingly moved by the instinct that had driven it. "You were handling it," he said, when she told him this. "I was, I know. Then why?" "Because," he said with the dry precision she had come to love absolutely. "I found I was unable to sit in another room while someone was being condescending about your work, and the most expedient solution was to address it directly. That is very protective behavior. I am a very protective person." "You are an extremely protective person," she agreed. "I find it mostly flattering and occasionally professionally inconvenient." "I will work on the calibration," he said. "Please do not change it entirely," she said. "Just calibrate it." He gave her the look that was his version of a warm smile, the one she had learned to read over months of close attention, the slight deepening of the silver in his eyes, the fractional softening at the corners of his mouth. It was, she thought, one of her favorite things. The blood covenant conversation happened 6 months after that, not because there was urgency and not because anything had changed, but because they were sitting in the garden of the Ravenshade Court's London property on a rare warm evening, and she had been watching the way the last light fell across the old stone walls and thinking about time in the way she sometimes did when she was very content, which was to say with a mixture of gratitude and the quiet awareness that it moved. "I want to discuss the third option," she said. Rasmus, who was reading beside her, set his book down immediately, which told her he had been waiting for this conversation with more patience than she had given him credit for. "Yes," he said. "I am not 26 anymore," she said. "I am 27 and a half, and I am not suggesting we do anything immediately or impulsively. But I want to say clearly that I have thought about it for a year and I know what I want, and I want you to know that." "What do you want?" he said quietly. "I want the anchor sharing protocol," she said. "Not because I am afraid of aging, not entirely, but because I want the time. I want the time to do the work I want to do and to be with you while I do it, and I want it to be a genuine choice made with full information, which I now have." She looked at him directly. "I also want you to understand that I have read the documentation of the mutual vulnerability aspect thoroughly, and I am not choosing it in spite of that. I am choosing it in part because of that. Because you have been vulnerable with me, and I want to be the same with you. I want it to go both ways." He was very still, not the guardedness of before, but something quieter and deeper, the stillness of someone letting something important fully arrive. "Lucia," he said, and her name in his voice had always been particular, but now it carried something that was not careful or measured or formal, something full and open. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "I told you on the night of the bond stabilization that you were the most extraordinary person I had encountered in 8 centuries. I want to revise that statement." She blinked. "Revise it how?" The statement was accurate but insufficient, he said. You are not only extraordinary in your capability. You are the person whose presence has made the last year feel different from the 800 that preceded it. You are the person I think of when I encounter something worth thinking about. You are the person whose judgment I trust more completely than any other. Not because I have assessed it, but because I know it. He reached out and took her hand with the care that was his permanent mode of touching her, deliberate and gentle and entirely certain. I am not a person who speaks this way easily. I want you to know I mean it exactly as I am saying it. She looked at him for a long moment, this ancient, regal, impossible, extraordinary man who had let her into the most defended place in his existence, and whose world had become entwined with hers in a way that felt both chosen and inevitable. I know you mean it, she said. That is one of the things I love most about you. When you say something, it is true. I love you, he said, with the same precision and the same weight as everything else he said. Simple and direct and completely without equivocation. I love you, she said back. I have been managing it for a while now, as previously established. You can stop managing it, I know. She squeezed his hand. That is what I am doing. The anchor sharing ceremony, when it happened, was private. No court attendance, no formal witnesses beyond Tavrik, and one healer from the Meridian Institute, who had been briefed on the protocol, and whose presence was required under supernatural medical law to document the procedure as performed safely and consensually. It took place in the same chamber where the bond stabilization had happened, which Lucia thought was appropriate in a way that was probably more sentimental than she would normally admit to, and which Rasmus did not comment on, but had clearly chosen with the same thought. It was not painful. She had prepared for pain, and it was not that. It was the sensation of something being woven in, a thread of warmth that settled into her chest alongside her own heartbeat, and felt not foreign but like a harmony, a second note that had always been implied by the first. She felt his presence in it, steady and deep and enormously familiar, and she understood, suddenly and completely, why the ancient texts had described the anchor sharing as mutual rather than transactional. She was not being given something, they were sharing something. There was a difference. When it was done, she looked at him and he looked at her, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. All the centuries of careful guard set aside entirely for this moment, this specific, clear, human and immortal moment of choosing each other. All right? He asked quietly. Better than all right, she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was the most formally romantic gesture she had ever been on the receiving end of, and she thought, with complete and unmanaged joy, that she would never stop finding him endlessly surprising. That was not, of course, the end of the politics. Politics did not end. Particularly not in the vampire world, where every generation of ambition ran up against institutions that had been old before the word institution was invented, and where the particular combination of immortality and power produced interpersonal dynamics that were baroque, to a degree that made human court intrigue look like a mild disagreement. 6 weeks after the ceremony, the Obsidian Conclave made one final attempt. They sent an emissary to the Ravenshade court, a vampire named Cressivane, who was about 400 years old, which in vampire terms meant he was young enough to still believe that audacity could substitute for strategy. He arrived with a formal delegation and a sealed document that he presented in the court's receiving hall, with the carefully calibrated poise of someone who had been told this was a winning move. The document was a formal challenge to the legitimacy of the anchor-sharing ceremony, arguing on the basis of an obscure provision in the Thessalian Accords that the protocol required conclave ratification to be legally binding, and that, without such ratification, the ceremony was void, and Lucia's continued presence in the court was a violation of the blood law provisions regarding unauthorized human attachment to sovereign vampire households. Lucia read it standing beside Rasmus in the receiving hall, and she felt his presence beside her shift into the quality that preceded absolute precision. He let her respond first. She had been counting on this, because she had known the challenge was coming, or something like it, since the publication of the research paper had made her too publicly connected to the court to ignore. She had spent 3 weeks preparing the legal architecture of the response, and she delivered it now in the same calm, documented, methodical voice. she used for everything that mattered. The Thessalian Accords provision that the conclave was citing had been superseded by the Meridian Compact of 1921, which established that anchor-sharing ceremonies performed with documented healer oversight were self-ratifying under supernatural medical law. The documentation from the ceremony had been filed simultaneously with the Meridian Institute and the Supernatural Accord Registry, which predated the conclave as a governing body and held superior jurisdictional authority in matters involving human welfare. Furthermore, the blood law provisions regarding unauthorized human attachment did not apply when the attachment had been formalized through a recognized supernatural medical protocol, which this had been, and attempting to apply them retroactively to a document ceremony was itself a violation of the Accord's protection provisions for healer-patient relationships. She cited every clause by number. The hall was very quiet when she finished. Cresivane looked at her with an expression that was known rapidly between contempt and the dawning realization that contempt was not going to be sufficient. Then Rasmus spoke. He had been silent throughout her response with the quality of someone who is listening rather than waiting. And now he said, in the voice that carried 8 centuries of absolute authority in every syllable, that the challenge was dismissed, that the emissary would depart the Ravenshade court within the hour, and that any further legal challenges to matters relating to his household would be met with a full review of the conclave's conduct in the Saravan affair, the documentation for which was preserved in an archive that was accessible to every member of the Supernatural Accord on formal request. The conclave, Lucia had learned, responded to 2 things reliably: evidence and consequence. Rasmus had just placed both on the table with characteristic precision. Cresivane departed within the hour. The conclave did not attempt another formal challenge. She learned, over the years that followed, the specific textures of a life built at the intersection of 2 worlds. She kept her work. She expanded it, actually, into a formal research division within the Ravenshade Court's resources that took on cases from across the supernatural medical community. The documentation of the bond stabilization had opened doors in the field that had been closed for decades, not because the cases had not existed, but because no one had previously survived them with enough understanding to describe what they had done. She trained other healers. She argued with Meridian Institute leadership approximately as often as she had argued with Vordakai, and won with about the same frequency. She learned the architecture of vampire court life, the old world rhythms that existed beneath the modern surface, the way that ancient codes of honor and contemporary law tangled together in ways that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes genuinely frustrating. She learned which battles were worth fighting in the formal court structure, and which were better addressed through the kind of quiet, documented precision that made opposition impractical rather than simply unwelcome. She learned Rasmus. This was, she thought, the largest and most ongoing project of everything. He was old and layered, and had been alone in the particular internal way of someone who had stopped expecting to be known, and the gradual revelation of him was a thing that happened in increments across months, and then years, small moments of honesty accumulating into something complete. His dry humor that surfaced most often when he was most comfortable. The precision of his care, which was never casual but always deliberate, always considered. The way he read her silences as accurately as she read his expressions. The particular attunement of 2 people who had learned each other at the level of energy and presence before they had fully learned each other at the level of words. The court changed around them too. Vordakai, having recalibrated his ambitions significantly, and then spent 2 years watching Lucia work with a wariness that gradually became something closer to reluctant respect, eventually became a reasonably functional member of the court's governing structure. He never lost his edge, but he learned Lucia suspected that an edge directed at the wrong targets was a political liability rather than an asset. She did not trust him fully, and she suspected she never would, but she understood him, and understanding was a workable foundation. Tavrik, who had always been quietly loyal, became something closer to a friend over time, which surprised her and then stopped surprising her, because Tavrik was, under the formal exterior, someone of genuine warmth and considerable humor that he deployed entirely in private. New alliances formed. New challenges arrived and were navigated, The world of vampire politics was not a place that arrived at permanent peace, but it was a place where stability could be built, carefully, with enough documentation and enough consistent action, into something that held. One evening, 2 years after the anchor sharing, they were walking in the court gardens, which Lucia had gradually populated with more growing things than the previous formal arrangement had contained. Because she liked things that grew, and Rasmus had found this both inexplicable and charming. The night was cool, and the city hummed at a distance beyond the walls, and the stars were out in the particular London way, mostly hypothetical but genuinely visible on clear nights. She was thinking about a case. She was often thinking about cases. He was aware of this, and had long since made peace with the fact that her thinking face, which was the face of someone about 3 layers of reality removed from the current location, was also the face she wore when they were together and comfortable, and she was most fully herself. "Lucia," he said. She surfaced. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and she looked up at him with the ease of 2 years of looking, and she saw in his expression something that was neither the guarded assessment of their early history nor the careful warmth of the months after the bond stabilization, but something that had been built from both of those into something larger and quieter and completely certain. He reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew something small. It was a ring. Not a human engagement ring precisely, though it was beautiful. A band of dark silver set with a stone that shifted between deep blue and clear silver when the light touched it, the colors of her eyes in some lights and of his in others, which she noted immediately because she noticed things. It was the kind of object that had been made very carefully and very intentionally. "I am," he said, in the precise and deliberate way that she loved, "asking you formally. Not because formality is required, but because this is the kind of thing I want you to know I am certain about, and I find that certainty is best conveyed by acts rather than only by words." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me? In whatever form is most meaningful to you, under whatever traditions you prefer, with the complete understanding that I intend it permanently, and that permanently, in our particular case, means something rather extended." Lucia looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about the first night in the chamber, the dying bond, and the 12 empty places where other healers had stood and left, and the way she had pressed her palm against his chest and felt the absence of something that should have been whole, and thought with the determined clarity that was her particular way of facing terror, "I will fix this." She had fixed it. And then, in the months and years that followed, they had fixed other things together, and built other things, and become something to each other that was permanent in the way that real things were permanent. Not because nothing would ever challenge it, but because it had been made from material that had proven its strength. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger, with a care that was entirely him, deliberate and sure, and then he held her hand for a moment in both of his, looking at it. "I was going to say something formal," he said. "What were you going to say?" "I was going to say that in 800 years of existence I had not previously understood that certainty and peace could inhabit the same place as something still surprising and still full." He looked at her. "I have been working on that sentence for some time." She stepped forward and put both arms around him, which required him to adjust his posture to accommodate her, and which he did with the immediate ease of someone for whom this specific gesture had become the most natural thing in the world. "That was a very good sentence," she said, against his shoulder. His arms came around her. "I have good material to work with," he said. Above them the stars were mostly hypothetical, and the city hummed, and the court walls held the night at a comfortable distance. And the bond that lived in her chest alongside her heartbeat hummed steady and bright and whole. And she thought, with complete and unmanaged happiness, that she had made a very good decision on the night when everyone else had left. She had stayed, and in staying she had found something that 8 centuries of careful guardedness had not been able to prevent, and 12 healers' worth of reasonable self-preservation instinct had not been able to produce. Something that was, when it arrived, entirely itself. Ancient and new, dangerous and safe, formal and tender, and built from trust and stubborn competence and the specific bravery of 2 people who had learned. Across the distance of centuries and one catastrophic night, that the most important decisions are the ones you make when every sensible voice in the room is telling you to leave. She had stayed, and in the steady warmth of the bond they shared, in the old stone walls of a court that had become home, in the presence of the ancient and extraordinary person who had called her the most extraordinary person he had encountered in 8 centuries, and meant it with the full precision of someone who chose every word on its merit. Lucia Whitlock understood completely, with the clarity that was her particular gift and her particular joy, that she always would,